Hey, Smarter News. Today we're going to talk about one of the biggest topics in the news in 2021, and that is the topic of borders, but not just our own border, our own southern border that gets a lot of attention, but also a border in Europe that's capturing a lot of attention there as well for completely different reasons. But there's interesting crossovers between these stories and also the potential to really impact your life in a very real way. So I want to break down a little bit of what you need to know about both of them and get you on your way today. So something happened in Washington, D.C. just yesterday. You had a hearing that was held by the Senate Judiciary Committee, that's Senator Durbin. And the person that was appearing before this hearing was the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Secretary Mayorkas. What's notable about this hearing, it was an oversight hearing. So one of the jobs of Congress is not just to figure out how to spend our money, but to provide oversight to make sure that we're being represented. And that basically what's happening in government is meeting our approval. Now that looks different depending on who is the representative, whether or not they're Democrat or Republican. Why I was paying close attention to this particular hearing is that it's the first major appearance by Secretary Mayorkas since we got those historic border numbers. Remember, we got the full year. So from October of last year to September of this past year, full numbers about what was happening at the U.S. southern border, the highest number of border encounters that we've ever seen. So I just want you to know that that hearing actually took place. I'm going to be looking through the footage. The meeting lasted just under 4 hours and pulling out some sound bites for you so that you can get a taste of some of the many different topics that were discussed during that time. Borders matter for many reasons. Let's just talk about that for a moment. Why do we care about borders? You know, you hear about national security, you hear about humanitarian crisis about in relation to the borders. All those things matter. Borders are about national identity. When you really strip everything away, how we define our property on this planet and what we do within that property is all about how a nation identifies itself. So that's why borders are really important. But, I was thinking about it last night. Borders are also in many ways seams, like seams in your clothes that link two sides. And oftentimes borders link two sides that maybe wouldn't choose to be linked. And that adds to the tension. It's what's going to add to the tension of this next story that I'm going to talk to you about that's happening in Europe. So we're going to return to what happened at the U.S. southern border in just a moment because we have new numbers that just came out this week that didn't get a lot of attention in the news. I'm going to talk about that. But in order to give that context, let's go over to Europe and talk about what's happening there. I'm going to bring you over to our handy dandy and old-fashioned globe that always is so good to me. So what we're going to be focusing on here is Belarus and Poland. Belarus, what's important to know about Belarus, close ally of Russia, not in the European Union like Poland here. Often this border is described as the edge of the EU because it's where the EU stops. And something's been happening between this border between Belarus and Poland. Want to point out a couple other things before we move on. Where does the U.S. military still have a big presence? Right here in Germany. What other border do we watch? Ukraine. Ukraine is not a part of the European Union. And there's a question about Russia's intentions for Ukraine. This is going to become part of the story in just a moment. But you can see Poland, Belarus, Ukraine. Here you got Russia. Here you got the rest of Europe. Okay, so let me catch you up about what's happening here. It's being described in a couple different ways. What you should know is that there's several thousand people at the border between Poland and Belarus. Mainly these people are from the Middle East. The theory that some are saying is that Belarus facilitated their travel to Belarus, to the border, with a promise of entering into the European Union. Belarus is not giving permanent home to these people, but Poland is not letting them enter. And these people are caught between these two sides. We're talking about a couple thousand. We've had some reported deaths, 11 at last check. The numbers are kind of all over the place. You're getting estimates of upwards of 4,000 people at the border. Yesterday it was 2,000, so it's changing very quickly. Some believe that there's 20,000 people headed towards that border in Belarus at this time. So what's actually happening there? Why would Belarus even do that? Why would Belarus allow people to come into their country and then push them to the Poland border? What is that really about? We have to go bigger, and we have to remember the alliance between Russia and Belarus. What does Russia really not want? Russia does not want a strong European Union and doesn't want a strong NATO either. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which, by the way, the United States is also a part of. Poland is a part of it as well. And so what has been a major issue of debate in the EU over the last several years? Immigration. Who's coming in? Who's coming out? What countries are doing? Kind of similar but not exactly the same to U.S. states and how we get into debates about what's happening, who's coming in, who's coming out, how are we doing it. And so, again, going back to some of the theories, the analysis of this foreign policy story is that Belarus is facilitating this travel and trying to foment a crisis of sorts at the border to see those frayed relationships in Europe. That's actually not happening right now. So they're trying to create instability, is the theory that some are saying. Belarus will say, no, we're not doing that publicly. Belarus is a state-owned media. It's hard to get, information, reliable information out of the country. You should know that as well. So that's why I'm saying the theory is, the analysis is, because that is sort of the popular belief about this situation. The reason why it has potentially impact your life is that because we're a member of NATO, and because that means if there's any sort of conflict that erupts, that the alliance means that we go in together. So Poland came to Afghanistan with us. If Poland gets into any sort of conflict, armed conflict or otherwise, we could be involved as well. And so we're not there yet, and I don't want to oversell that. But the potential for conflict is really there because you have both Belarus and Poland pushing their forces towards this border. And a big question about what happens to these innocent people that were promised something are now in frigid, terrible conditions in Eastern Europe in the winter and with nowhere to go. So how does this problem get solved? And the question is, does it get much worse before it gets any better? In the meantime, we're also watching Russia building up some troops on the border of Ukraine. And the Secretary of State, the U.S. Secretary of State, has made a reference that this is something that Russia did before invading Ukraine in the past. There's been a lot of attention watching that over the last couple weeks, last couple months. So we really have to, what is Russia? What is the intention here of Russia and Belarus? What's the broader picture? And I just want you to aware that it's happening. We're going to keep track of it. And it's a reminder that issues about a border have wide ripple effects. That's not just unique in the United States. Sometimes it's easy to think, well, our border is the only one that we have a lot of conflict and stories about, but that's not the case. Let's just wrap it back up. Remember those numbers. A couple thousand people, significant, kids as well, on the border between Poland and Belarus. We just got new numbers, so it's the first month. We got numbers for October. The first month of 2022 at the U.S. southern border showed about 160,000 people. I'm going to show you this graph. Why not? Let's just do it together. This is my Vanna White moments that I, sorry about that I appreciate. So this is last year, right? Last year was this big record number, just under 2 million people, 1.7 million people were at the U.S. southern border, encountered last year, a record number. Here's where we are in October. It's a decline from where we were last month, but it's still 160,000 people that were encountered at the U.S. southern border. So that gives you an idea. A couple thousand people is causing, is really capturing the attention of all of Europe, and a question of an international crisis. We have more than 100,000 people coming across the border or encountered at the border, not necessarily staying in America, but encountered at the border on any given month. And so that kind of gives us perspective. We can't make direct comparisons because the United States is a much bigger country than Poland and Belarus, but I thought that context gives us some perspective. Do you guys have any questions before I get going on any of this? I know it's a lot. We're going to be covering a few different international stories that really have a lot of complicated factors. And I just want to give you some of the basics so that if you see any headlines kind of out of the corner of your eye, you have a little foundation to build on from that. So keep your questions and comments coming. We'll have more on this on smarternews.com. And all of our content, as you know, is always there. So go ahead and check out our website, smarternews.com, for more. And I look forward to hearing from you. Have a great day, guys. I'll talk to you soon.